The first time many German infantrymen encountered the PPSh-41, it wasn't the weapon silhouette that registered. It was a sudden density of sound and impact at close range, a burst that felt less like aimed fire and more like a moving wall. In 1941-42, as the Eastern Front collapsed into forests, villages, trenches, and shattered city blocks, the Red Army's growing reliance on mass-issued submachine guns changed what contact meant at under 150 meters. The PPSh-41 stamp construction made it fast to build in huge numbers, and its 71-round drum offered sustained fire that German squads, often centered on rifles and a single light machine gun, could not always answer instantly. The complication wasn't simply a better gun. It was the way Soviet tactics, production momentum, and close-quarter geography combined into a new kind of pressure. Short-range fights where seconds, not marksmanship, decided who stayed upright. German riflemen were trained for precision and fire discipline, methodically engaging targets at distance with bolt-action Kar 98 chaos, while the squad's MG-34 or MG-42 provided suppressive backbone. That doctrine worked in open fields and coordinated advances, but inside ruined apartment blocks in Stalingrad or along the frozen tree lines near Leningrad, visibility shrank to meters and engagements erupted without warning. A Soviet infantryman armed with a PPSh-41 could fire nearly 1,000 rounds per minute from a weapon that weighed less than 9 pounds loaded, sweeping corridors or trenches with overlapping arcs of 7.62 by 25 millimeters Tokarev rounds that punched through winter coats and wooden cover alike. The psychological effect was cumulative. German soldiers began to associate the wet, crackling rhythm of the PPSh with sudden reversal, with losing initiative they thought they held, with corners that should have been safe suddenly erupting in close-range chaos. It wasn't fear of a single weapon. It was the creeping realization that Soviet industry had answered German tactical superiority not with better training or doctrine, but with sheer volume of firepower deliverable by ordinary conscripts in the kind of terrain where doctrine dissolved. By late 1942, after a month of urban combat and forest warfare, captured PPSh-41s were appearing in German hands not as trophies, but as working tools, preferred over issued MP-40s for their magazine capacity and reliability in cold and mud. The complication had shifted. The weapon German soldiers once feared, they now coveted, and that shift carried its own tension, logistical, tactical, and psychological. The PPSh-41 had become a mirror, reflecting back the weaknesses in German infantry firepower at the ranges where the war was increasingly being decided. As the front hardened and German units adapted, the PPSh-41 stopped being only a threat and became a contested resource. Capture examples spread because they worked, reliably in dirt and cold, with a rate of fire and magazine capacity that felt decisive in raids, house clearing, and sudden trench collisions. But escalation brought its own friction. Ammunition supply, magazine fit, and battlefield identification all became operational problems, not footnotes. German command answered with pragmatism, issuing captured guns under the designation MP-717R, then moving toward a formal conversion program to standardize logistics. The turning point arrives when the Wehrmacht officially adopts converted PPSh-41s as MP-41R, swapping barrels and adding a magazine adapter to accept MP-40 magazines in 9 by 19 millimeters parabellum. The panic begins to look less like fear of the unknown and more like fear of losing control, of supply, of recognition, of tempo, and of the close-range initiative the PPSh could seize in an instant. German armorers and field workshops began modifying captured PPSh-41s by replacing the original 7.62 by 25 millimeters barrel with a 9 millimeters barrel and fitting a magazine well adapter, allowing the weapon to accept standard MP-40 stick magazines. This was improvisation. It was institutionalized battlefield adaptation, formalized in Wehrmacht manuals and supply chains. Yet the conversion carried a cost. The iconic 71 round drum, the feature that made the PPSh so effective in sustained close-quarters fire, was sacrificed for logistical compatibility. German soldiers who fought against PPSh-equipped Soviet units understood the irony. They were standardizing away the very advantage they had envied. The escalation also revealed a deeper anxiety. Soviet production of the PPSh-41 exceeded 6 million units by war's end, flooding the front with a weapon that required minimal training and could be maintained by soldiers with little technical background. German factories, meanwhile, struggled to match that output with the more complex MP-40, which demanded machine parts and tighter tolerances. The PPSh's stamped steel receiver and simple blowback mechanism meant it could be mass-produced in factories that had never made firearms before, using labor forces with minimal specialized skills. For German commanders, this wasn't just a tactical problem. It was an industrial signal, a reminder that Soviet wartime mobilization had achieved a scale and efficiency that German planners had underestimated. The turning point wasn't a single battle or design change. It was a moment when German soldiers and officers alike realized that the PPSh-41 was an anomaly or a stopgap, but a sustainable, scalable solution to infantry firepower that the Wehrmacht could not match pound for pound. The panic, in other words, was rooted not in mythology but in mathematics. The cold calculus of production capacity, battlefield saturation, and the shifting geometry of modern infantry combat. By the middle years of the war, the hidden truth is that German anxiety around the PPSh-41 was never purely about its technical profile. It was about what it signaled: Soviet recovery, industrial scale, and an infantry doctrine increasingly built around concentrated short-range fire. Even the German solution carried irony. Converting PPSh-41s to 9mm ease ammunition and magazine logistics, yet surrendered the very feature German soldiers most envied, the 71 round drum, and turned a captured advantage back into something more familiar, more regulated, and therefore less disruptive. In that sense, the story resolves with quieter insight. The PPSh-41 psychological effect came from a complete system: mass production feeding frontline saturation, tactics shaped for brutal proximity, and a weapon robust enough to keep working when conditions should have stopped it. German troops didn't panic because the PPSh was mythical. They panicked because it made close combat feel suddenly crowded, faster than training, and wider than a single squad could comfortably contain. The weapon's reputation was built not on propaganda, but on lived experience. The sound of a drum magazine emptying in a narrow trench, the sight of Soviet infantry advancing through rubble with submachine guns held low, the recognition that suppressive fire alone wouldn't stop an enemy armed with enough ammunition to sustain overlapping bursts for minutes at a time. German after-action reports from Stalingrad, Kursk, and the Rzhev salient repeatedly note the psychological pressure of facing mass PPSh fire, describing it not as superior marksmanship, but as a kind of mechanical persistence that overwhelmed individual skill. The resolution, then, is less about the weapon itself and more about what it exposed: the limits of doctrine built around precision, an economy of fire when facing an opponent willing to trade accuracy for volume, complexity for simplicity, and craftsmanship for scale. The PPSh-41 didn't win the Eastern Front, but it reshaped the texture of infantry combat there, forcing German units to fight on Soviet terms and spaces where German advantages, coordination, training, equipment quality, couldn't fully manifest. By 1943, the sight of German soldiers carrying captured PPSh-41s was no longer unusual. It was a tacit admission that the weapon's design philosophy, cheap, durable, abundant, had proven more adaptable to realities of the Eastern Front than the Wehrmacht's own. The panic, in the end, was a recognition that war had moved beneath the level where superior tactics and training could guarantee victory, into a realm where industrial capacity, logistical endurance, and the willingness to equip millions of soldiers with good enough weapons could decide outcomes. The PPSh 41 was never the best submachine gun of the war by traditional measures, but it was the right weapon for the war the Soviets were fighting, and that alignment between tool, doctrine, and industrial reality was what German soldiers felt in their gut every time they heard that unmistakable cyclic rattle echoing through frozen streets and shattered forests.